You're listening to Decolonisation, a podcast series that explores how Ukraine and Eastern Europe are perceived globally, and why countering Russian imperial influence is crucial for the future of global democracy. The podcast is created by Ukrainian International, and I'm your host, Anastasiia Marushevska. Today I'm talking with Jade McGlynn, a leading British expert on Russia, memory politics, history and identity construction. She is a researcher in the War Studies Department at King's College London and author of the books Russia's War and Memory Makers, The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia. Welcome, Jade, and thank you again for joining us. I would like to start with the first question. That you have conducted impressive research on Russian society, on propaganda and memory politics. Can you tell us more what motivated you to pursue this research in the first place?
So in terms of what motivated me to pursue this area, I taught myself Russian when I was 12 because I was very interested in kind of histories of the late Tsarist period and the revolutionary period. But also, I've long been studying, Russia and I suppose the broader region, as awful as that sounds, but historically. And in terms of the actual question around memory politics, really that was just living in Russia in 2014 and just being really quite fascinated by the coverage of the Euromaidan and then the Revolution of Dignity on Russian state media or state affiliated channels, and then speaking to friends or colleagues or, acquaintances and understanding that not always, but quite often these narratives resonated on some level, and then really becoming interested in Russia's search, I suppose, for a question of who is Russia, sort of why is Russia a nation and, or is it a nation? And this kind of, I suppose, quest to find a post-Soviet Russian identity that Yeltsin famously launched, but never succeeded in finding.
And as a result of your living and research in Russia, you have two books, which is a whole different big topic. And I think you've been asked many questions, especially regarding your book, Russia's War. But maybe you have a few ideas what was the most surprising for you when you actually moved to Russia and started seeing how they depict Maidan and what they're saying. Maybe there's few insights that you would like to share that would resonate also with people from the West who actually started understanding Russia a little bit more only in 2022.
I think I'm a bit of an unusual or unhelpful example. I first went to Russia in 2008 and it was to St. Petersburg, and I spent sort of the summer there, a couple of months. And then in that time, to be honest with you, Russian politics to me seemed, somebody who was more interested in Russia, in sort of the culture and history, seemed really quite boring. I was obviously very naive and obviously incorrect, but though I was not unique in this assumption, that I kind of thought that Russia would sort of just kind of trundle along a sort of certain path of development. I should stress I was really quite young as well at this point. I was not a kind of politically clearly not particularly well informed. And it was really 2011, 2012 that kind of shook me out of that realization. But in the meantime, I'd also spent a lot of time in a Russian village, working at an orphanage for children with what they called kind of psychological and intellectual limitations. Often that wasn't the case, and obviously I wouldn't use that term anyway. Unfortunately, that knowledge of what happens in these places continues to haunt me, especially now, not just for the Russian children, but because, of course, many of the Ukrainian children who are being deported from the temporarily occupied territories and sent to Russia, they're often placed in similar institutions. But I think that knowledge early on of the, Moscow and St. Petersburg were not Russia, I think was very helpful to me in preparing me for a lot of things, perhaps preparing to face things as they were and my future time in the regions as well. But I would say that perhaps in some ways I didn't need to go to the regions, because I remember the most shocking thing for me, again, at sort of, very young, was in St. Petersburg during that first summer when I got into a conversation with Russians about democracy, and generally, quite a few people, they just did not like democracy. And to me, coming from England, the idea that somebody wouldn't like democracy, it just completely broke my mind, which probably feels very naive now in 2022. But at the time, I just could not fathom why somebody would not want democracy. And in some ways, I didn't properly begin to unpick that question until 2014, at least certainly not in a proper sort of scholarly way.
As Ukrainian, for us, we're fighting a lot for this right to be heard, because we know Russia, understand Russia pretty well, even though we still lack some kind of academic research, which, for example, you do. But I think in general, the mentality and in general, like societal dynamics, we understand pretty well. And for us, it's no surprise somehow, the reaction of Russians and actually their lack of desire to improve their country and things like this. And today, in general, I would like to focus more somehow not on Russia itself, but on effects of the policies of Russian Empire and Soviet Union and modern Russia that still have this effect on the way not just Ukraine, what Ukraine struggles with, but also what we can see in the West, in the so-called collective West. And one of the reasons actually I thought about this podcast is because of the way Western academia works and misconceptions that still exist and kind of problems within the so-called Eastern European or Slavic studies. And you're an academic at King's College and you earned your PhD at Oxford. To your experience, how Ukraine and Eastern, maybe Central Europe are portrayed in university studies?
I think the biggest issue is probably the ways in which they're not portrayed in some ways. It's the absence. Obviously the funding or the focus on that kind of Eastern European into Russia region, the more likely you are to have, to have some coverage at least. But I think it's an issue because, of course, if one were to learn about, for example, Russian history through reading the books of Razanovsky, for example, and that's not then balanced by an understanding of, Polish narratives of their history or Baltic narratives of their history or Ukrainian narratives of their history, it's very easy to accept the Russian narrative as broadly correct. And I think that's how we're still in a situation where so many people, believe that essentially, Kiev and Rus is the origins of the Russian state, or you have comments like, oh, but, Kiev was the first capital of Russia, which is clearly historically completely inaccurate. And yet, as somebody who's obviously read their fair share of Russian history books, I can understand how somebody who's not a specialist would get to that point and, and they wouldn't get to it from a point of malice. And I think that often there's kind of a threefold problem. I think one of them is, yes, the perpetuation of Russian imperial narratives without enough of a critical kind of engagement, and particularly without any engagement with alternative narratives, or just narratives from, the places that actually experience these historical changes that were often forced on them by Russia. I think the second problem, though, is also, I think, an issue of mirror imaging sometimes, in the sense that people, because the problem isn't just that the problem isn't just that Ukrainian or other voices aren't heard. It's also that we have really quite a peculiar and particular understanding of Russia as well. It would be one thing if, the study of Russia was truly excellent and superb, but it was too Russia focused. But I'm not sure that's a problem that many universities in the West are suffering from. And I think part of that's to do with mirror imaging. We want to very much focus on those parts of Russian society that confirm existing myths, or on those parts of Russian history or literature that confirm kind of existing myths or interests. And we don't want to focus on the bits that don't fit that kind of pre-existing vision of Russia. And then I think the third part of the issue is the general defunding and disengagement with area studies, with regional studies in general, because that then makes it much harder to change the field. I mean, there are some really interesting new initiatives that have been, I think, provoked by the 2022 full-scale invasion, though it immediately begs the question of why not sooner. I suppose better late than never. But there are some really interesting new initiatives that focus on trying to broaden the field. But ultimately, when there are very few professorships in general, and when they're all still, it's very difficult to find pathways for younger scholars into academia, or even just to stay in academia. I think that this is a problem that's going to be really, really hard to fix, because it intersects with structural issues within Western academia, intersects with a tendency to prefer kind of theories that aren't, that are very generalist. And of course, that's not to kind of engage in the normal area studies versus IR beef, though obviously everybody has a side. But because I do think that it's helpful to have that comparative element and to have that, a broader kind of overview and structural vision that sometimes can be lacking. I know is certainly lacking often in my own analysis, because I'm very focused on Russia and Russia and Ukraine. But it needs to be complemented, and I think that can only be done, by more funding for the area. But that funding cannot be provided without looking at and changing some of the, without a deliberate effort to not just include but to centre new visions, because otherwise we're going to keep on getting Russia wrong. We're just going to keep on, so this isn't even just a purely kind of knowledge, pursuit of knowledge exercise, though that in itself would be enough. This is also really questions of national security, much like the original establishment of the kind of area study centres in the UK were during the Cold War.
Yeah, I completely agree that it's in many ways a security question. And I just a little story time. Yeah, in 2023, I participated in the report on the historical context of Russian propaganda, which was supported by NATO and prepared by the PR Army team. And I presented it in NATO headquarters. And in general, it was received very well, except that I received a question regarding Vladimir the Great. The Prince of Kievan Rus, who baptized Kievan Rus in 988. And the question that I received challenged his ethnicity, claiming that he was neither Ukrainian or Russian, and his family line is actually coming from Scandinavia. And I tried to explain that when we discuss Kievan Rus, so we discuss Ukraine, we're referring to a political nation, not an ethnicity-based one. And I pointed out that some of the British kings had French origins, yet France is not trying to invade Britain, and Sweden also not trying to invade Ukraine to claim Vladimir the Great. In the same time, Russia continues to justify the invasion through these kind of distorted version of history, where Vladimir the Great is Russian, where Kievan Rus is actually the beginning of Russia. And can you, maybe from your research and from your line of work, explain what methods Russia uses to distort history and kind of to propagate it abroad as well? And maybe why this narrative is still effective, even after so many work done to kind of counter-attack the wrong historical claims.
I think in a way you almost explained yourself there why it's effective. And I think that's because I think or at least one of the ways that it's effective, and that's because it functions almost as a distraction. You get so involved in all of these details. And, with something like, the medieval polity of Kiev and Rus, there's not that much historical evidence to go on. You could really argue, and historians will, I'm sure, continue to, and they are best placed to argue the difference about this or that aspect of it, until, as long as you wanted to for the rest of your life. The point is that none of it is relevant. I think I've said this previously, even if, and it's very much not, but even if all of Vladimir Putin's history rants were correct, even if they were, excellent history, which they're not, they're terrible, terrible history. Even if they were, what on earth does that have to do with why Russia is bombing residential buildings in Kharkiv, on a near daily basis? What on earth does it have to do with Russia deporting Ukrainian children? What on earth does it have to do with Russians torturing people, because of their religious beliefs in the occupied territories, because of the fact, with burning Ukrainian books? It has absolutely no link. And in a way, it's about moving the conversation onto a different level, which is a question around legitimacy and great powerness and all of these really rather abstract concepts that I don't think should have any place in anybody's mind who even professes to care about, the rights of the individual or human rights in general, or a legal or, a vaguely kind of rules-based, environment in which we can live as different nations. So I think that's one aspect, is just this, it has this huge distracting element because, like you said, I'm not sure sometimes looking at the state of Britain that I would be hugely against Denmark coming over and trying to recolonize us, but that's obviously a different situation. The point is that the questions of history for us, they can remain questions of history to a large part, whereas questions of history in countries that have had their history not just repressed, but sometimes, completely manipulated and distorted, like Britain did to many countries as well, obviously, as an imperial power. It's a question then of identity. The problem is that Russia is also making history a question of identity and a question of national security. And I think anybody who's read the national security strategy from 2021 with its, numerous references to culture, to historical memory, an entire section on protecting the kind of cultural roots and historical memory of the Russian people, can understand that they clearly see culture, that the Kremlin elites clearly see culture and history in a very different way to that which it is seen in the West as a sort of apolitical element. That's not to say that culture and history are always treated apolitically, but in general, a sort of view. I think people would be surprised if the next integrated review, for example, in the UK, had a very large section on protecting Britain's historical memory. And hopefully they would also be slightly appalled, because it's not normally a sign of a secure and confident nation. Another reason why I think it resonates is because ultimately, if we actually listen to a lot of what the Kremlin is putting out, and it's not just the Kremlin, it does meet a certain demand within society, for a need to feel proud, a need to kind of have a coherent biography of what Russia is. But I think one of the reasons why it resonates abroad as well is because it's part of a kind of, I would say it's part of a broader illiberal memory that's on the rise. So if we say that liberal memory, which kind of came to dominate after the fall of the Berlin Wall, is this idea that you come to terms with a nation comes to terms with and repents for the bad things it did in its past, and then it overcomes them, can sort of move on into progress, and it learns the lessons. Illiberal memory is really the rejection of that, and is instead an idea that, memory is almost like zero sum. So if somebody's putting out negative narratives about you, you have to that's an attack on your identity. You have to defend it, and you have to put out negative narratives about your enemies, or about those who are supposedly kind of falsifying or telling the truth, as it were, about your own history. But it's also framed as almost much like illiberalism in the broader sense, as a kind of effort to get back to an original state or to an authentic state. So to get rid of the kind of elite or liberal elite kind of imposition of a global citizen of nowhere, their terms, not mine, identity, and to restore not all of the past, but elements of the past that were good. So great power status, control over certain historical lands that you perceive to be historically yours, a sense of, returning to a certain type of values. And I think that's part of the reason why there's been some success with it, because it's been able to tap in. Now, clearly there are different demographics. There's a certain section of the far left that just, for some reason, is unable to, open Google and understand what type of regime is currently in power in Russia, and it's very far from their dreams of communist utopia. But that's a specific kind of historical legacy issue. I think more broadly what we're talking about is that Russia is able to tap in through what is happening in Russia is particularly intense in its misuse of history, and it's tying up with certain historical narratives as matters of national security and identity. It's a very intense form, but I don't think it's unique to Russia, though Russia may be unique in terms of how aggressively it acts on it. I don't think it's unique, and I think therefore that enables it to tie in with other, I think also pretty lamentable uses of history that we can see in pretty much every country in the world, certainly the countries in Europe and the broader so-called West.
Yeah, I think George Orwell talked about it as well. Yeah, he said that from the totalitarian point of view, history is something to be created rather than learned. And Russia is definitely not unique in this. For example, USSR did it. It was one of the, I guess, main propaganda tools to not just distort reality, but also to make it impossible for people to actually learn the correct history.
I would say I think there are interesting similarities, but also interesting differences between what Russia currently does with history and what the Soviet Union did, because the Soviet Union the Soviet Union tried to destroy evidence, for example, of other history. So
yeah.
If like the Panfilov's 28 Men, there was the they tried very hard to get rid of, to destroy the Afanasyev report that came out under Brezhnev, showing that the men, it was all just basically a total legend. In Russia, there's a sort of slightly postmodernist element that really the Soviet Union didn't have, where if we think back to the sacking of Sergei Mironenko, for example, in 2015, which was over him saying, he was the head of the Russian archives, it was over him saying, well, yeah, of course, it's kind of basically a nonsense, it's a myth, the story of Panfilov's 28 Men. And then he was sacked for saying this, and when he was asked, the then culture minister Vladimir Medinsky, who also is widely rumored to have ghostwritten Putin's infamous On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians essay, when asked, well, why was he sacked? Because, he's right. This is a total myth. He said, well, some myths are true, some myths are truer than facts. And I thought that should almost be like a catchphrase or a slogan. That's what you see as a country acting on myths as if they were facts.
Yeah, but it's interesting that, inside Russia, there is this kind of structure, which is, I guess, not just about history, but about politics of memory in many ways. But when it comes to, for example, Western academia, because general population, the fact that they believe in some kind of narratives it's a complex issue, but we more or less can understand how it works. But what strikes me every time is when people who are actually the one that teach other people, and they kind of refuse to accept a new reality that Russia cannot be the one voice of the whole region, that books need to be adapted, that you cannot teach history of Ukraine by Russian or Soviet books. And I think it's also about Eastern Europe as well, not just about Ukraine. But why do you believe it's still exists? Why do academics still kind of protect their idea of the way these so-called Eastern European studies or in general history needs to be taught?
think there are different reasons, and for different academics, it will be different elements. I mean, part of it is just career. If you've spent your entire kind of career getting kind of research grants, and probably studying, around, on a particular thesis that Russia does X, Y, Z, or Russia is X, Y, Z, you're going to react badly if somebody asks you to come and change that. I think that's, of course, no justification. It's just an explanation of why. I think in particular that's true of not all, very much not all, but of a notable section of those who kind of came of age and, let's say, did their first sort of time in Russia in the late 90s or the sort of early 2000s, because often their view of Russia is sort of was formed during that period. And if you spent that time in Moscow or St. Petersburg, it forms a very certain, a very particular understanding of Russia. But I think part of it is also because many Western countries are also, post-imperial nations, to be honest. And I think, in part it's because we probably don't want to decolonize ourselves. And we don't want to, think about, we don't want to have all the histories rewritten so that we have to read of people's, we worry that if Russia is decolonized, then we have to be decolonized properly. And I think that the resistance to kind of centering the narratives of colonized nations is not something that's just specific to Ukraine. I think there are specific issues in Ukraine's case that I'll come on to in a second. But I think it's also a resistance in general to decentering colonized narratives. And I think part of the issue is that Ukraine doesn't get much solidarity from people who are generally, quite pro decolonization and these methods. And part of the issue for that is because there is a very Western-centric view of empire. That empire involves non-contiguity, i.e. that it's not just about expanding further, like Russia did. It involves sort of getting on some boats like the Brits did, and going to other lands. And I think part of the issue as well is because we haven't, and there's an idea that imperialism is something that, that white people do to non-white people. And there hasn't really been engagement, for example, with the Ottoman Empire, against many nations in the Balkans, and there really hasn't, been engagement. And there's a resistance to Russia as an empire, even though in many cases, in Russia's case, particularly if you look further east in the conquest of Siberia, you have pretty textbook cases of that would fit, the rather simplistic metric of white people going and subjugating non-white peoples.
Yeah, of course. But what's interesting for me as well is that this conversation, specifically around, I would say, Central Eastern Europe and partially around Ukraine, is not new. Because before Milan Kundera, Czech writer, intellectual, he discussed it in his famous essay Kidnapped West, which is, I would say, became very popular in Ukraine in the recent years, because he talks about decolonization somehow without actually using the term, but he explains that he calls for recognition of nations like former Czechoslovakia, Poland, or Hungary. And he's addressing that totalitarian communism somehow and Russian influence deprived these countries of cultural independence, and it left them stagnant, and that those nations actually are fighting for common European values right now, and they're still not recognized as equals somehow. And it's not just Kundera said this, it's also Czesław Miłosz. He talked about it in early 50s, which is, I would believe that in academic circles, this conversation is pretty lasting one. But now Ukraine needs to repeat this argument again somehow, that Russia is an empire, that our culture is being destroyed, that we need to decolonize the perception of our countries for basically better security and democracy in general and for European values. So you partially answered of why for academics, maybe on a personal level, it's hard to change their approach. But why do you think in general this process is not perceived, as you mentioned, kind of an issue of security? Where is kind of lacking motivation or aim to actually achieve it and to do it properly?
It's funny because I don't have a very good answer to your question, because I also ask myself this question. So I can't pretend to have a perfect answer, because I also don't fully understand why, if I'm honest. And it's something that I come up against. In general, I think that a big part of the problem is just a lack of knowledge. About that enables people to just accept the kind of simplistic, pre-existing kind of narratives that already are sort of in currency. And I think a real inability in the West to not engage in mirror imaging. In particular, I think what I would say is quite an ideological faith in the idea that things will ultimately, that the arc of human history, in Martin Luther King's famous words, ultimately bends towards justice, that things will basically be all right, and that all nations just want, and all peoples just want to live like us, and then to find kind of explanations as to why that isn't happening. So in Russia's case, for example, you constantly see efforts to almost compare Russians and Ukrainians. So if we think about headlines saying about Russians fleeing the war, well, they're not fleeing the war, are they? Because with the exception maybe of a few people in Kursk, Ukrainians are fleeing war, Russians are fleeing, the Kremlin dictatorship or repressive methods or, mobilization. And I think in part, it's a question I think about a lot. I think it probably stems from something quite good, which is an inability to accept that, a significant minority of Russians truly, really, really support the war, and the majority are basically willing to go along with it. And I think that's hard for some reason for people in the West to accept. So I think there's a refusal to kind of learn from what history is telling us, and also a refusal to see what is literally happening right now. And when you have a lot of people in whose interest it is, maybe because of maybe because of previous policies or arguments that they've pursued, and an unwillingness to kind of admit, hey, I got it wrong, which I always think is a strength. I've got lots of things wrong. Then it pushes decision makers or policy makers or, influential people who maybe don't have the time to really sit and, engage with these topics. It tells them what they want to hear, i.e. like this is just a problem that's caused by basically one guy, and once he's gone, everything can just go back to normal, and, we can all just kind of go back to some sort of status quo. Yeah, Ukraine will have to have some reparations, but basically it will all be fine. And it's that sort of level of complacency, to be blunt, completely terrifies me, because that's not the reality that we're living in. It's certainly not the reality Ukrainians are living in. And I think it will spell a truly dreadful geopolitical alignment and future for countries in the West. And
in general for your work, because what you mentioned about your work by research in Russia, you actually assist in the process of decolonization of Ukraine, because you're explaining the core of Russian Empire and its influence on neighboring country. But in one of your interviews, you mentioned that you're feeling a sense of guilt towards Ukraine due to your time living and working in Russia. Can you explain the origin? Maybe can you explain the origin of your desire to actually go to Russia, and also this feeling of guilt that you have now?
Well, it's interesting because I first went to Ukraine in 2012, and when I knew that Ukraine was going to be a very central part of my PhD, in 2017 when I started it, that's when I started to formally study Ukrainian, because I understood that if I was going to write a lot about Russian narratives about Ukraine, I also needed to understand, at least to be able to read and listen to kind of Ukrainian sources and what, you write about what your scholars write about your history.
Yeah.
And so I think there's always, I suppose I always had a long-standing kind of fondness anyway for Ukraine. And, you know, one of the reasons why I left Russia, the decisive reason why I left Russia was because of 2014 and Russian aggression towards Ukraine. In terms of why I feel guilty, I think because ultimately, you know, I mean, I think that anybody who spent their life studying Russia and trying at least to explain certain aspects of it, to research and understand certain aspects of it, who did not prepare their own country or, you know, in some way influence their own publics for quite how I think deeply unwell that society and the people who rule it have become, should feel some guilt. I think that, you know, our job as Russianists is to produce knowledge, and clearly, you know, the knowledge that I produce, maybe it was closer than some, fine, but ultimately, you know, I failed to understand that Russia would do what it is doing to Ukraine right now. And as somebody who obviously spends about 40% of their time in Kharkiv, you know, I think I have to take responsibility for being part of that overall kind of epistemological or, you know, information sort of based failure to explain Russia. And I think that doesn't mean that I should just sit there kind of hating myself. But it does mean that, you know, as somebody who studied Russia and also, you know, obviously studied Ukraine to a much lesser extent, but still, I think that leaves me with an ethical responsibility to assess where I went wrong and, you know, to go through my working out and, you know, to learn and to listen and to basically to do a better job.
Well, it's very refreshing to hear this because, you know, when you see, New York Times or Washington Post, they're just taking the journalists from Moscow and they're sending them to Kyiv to be like heads of their bureaus here without any reflection on what did they do there as journalists all this time. Till after the full-scale invasion in 2022, did they actually do their job correctly? Because it feels like they were living in the bubble there, in Moscow, St. Petersburg bubble without actually understanding where they are. And, you know, you often hear this separation between, well, there is Russian politics, or there is this and that, but there is also great Russian culture. Do you think that Russian culture is truly great?
I think that some forms of literature are always, I think that there is great culture, if you see what I mean. I think there are problems with ascribing it as something kind of unique or mystical as Russian. I mean, I have tastes that I know for some of my Ukrainian friends are still problematic, but in the interest of honesty, I mean, I do still enjoy Dostoevsky. I think he provides insights into some of the problems that still plague Russian society today and into some of these kind of philosophical debates. I understand that he is, to be honest with you, I'm kind of surprised sometimes it took so long for Dostoevsky to be cancelled because he's very politically problematic. But in the same way that, for example, people can enjoy Salvador Dali's art without supporting Franco or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I think you can still enjoy Russian culture and Russian art. I don't think that we've really seen a cancelling of it. I'm not aware of it anyway. I think that nobody really has a problem. Certainly nobody's come around to my house and taken my Dostoevsky books. They remain safe, which is not what can be said about poetry, for example, of Taras Shevchenko in the occupied territories. So first of all, I think there needs to be a bit of, in the West, from the Western point of view, I think there needs to be a bit less moaning and crying about great Russian culture, which is fine. You know, Russian literature is fine. You can still buy it if you want it. And a lot more focus on why books are being burnt in the occupied territories, what's happening to Ukraine's numerous cultural artifacts, museums that are being looted, where all of the, in many cases where almost all of the valuable artifacts are being taken off and then re-registered as Ukrainian. So I think, look, people's personal tastes, what they enjoy in terms of culture and art, that's up to them. And that's a matter of private taste, as I say. I have mine, and I'm sure it's very problematic mine, but they're my personal taste. They're what I find, useful and thought-provoking. But I think there needs to be a huge sense of perspective, because, I don't really understand why there is this huge focus on Russian culture and art right now. It in no way provides an explanation or excuse of what's happening today. It's relevant, I mean, from the way I understand why Ukrainians focus on it. It's not a comment against Ukrainians. I understand why, because obviously it's just it's a prioritization and effort to make Russia a victim again, rather than the perpetrator as it is.
Yeah, but it's funny because Russia itself, it does not look at culture, I believe, just as something that is in the museums or in books. Mm-hmm. Because when they were oppressing nations, including Ukraine, they were, for example, starving villages to death during Holodomor, or they were attacking the folk, somehow part of culture. Mm-hmm. They were attacking language, and because they were doing both. They were executing intellectuals and writers, but they were also destroying villages as a major resistance against kind of this real everyday culture. Yeah, like the destruction of real everyday culture. So it's interesting that in general in the West, Russian culture is discussed from the perspective of Dostoevsky or ballet, when it actually does not represent the culture of society. It's just something that Russia sold to the world, I guess. And you mentioned already about Russia stealing Ukrainian culture, and it's been happening more or less for what we know since 12th century, and where they stole the so-called Vladimir version, or how we call it in Ukraine, the Vyzhgorod icon of the Mother of God, which is now in Tretьякov Gallery in Moscow. And there's also Scythian artifacts, Scythian gold, which was looted during centuries. And almost all Ukrainian Baroque architecture was destroyed, including wooden churches, by Russian occupiers during different epoch. And of course, full-scale invasion brought even more destruction, because many museums are destroyed with missiles and being looted. And it's interesting, from your experience of research in Russia, how do Russians explain this appropriation of stolen cultural heritage to themselves?
It's not really something that comes up, which makes it easier to explain if you just don't deal with it. And I think, if we think, let's say in Britain, which again, I find it helpful sometimes to compare, you have many, many cases. We have obviously the British Museum, a very infamous case of mass cultural appropriation, and lots of debate around it. And you can take your side, but there is at least a debate. I mean, you just don't have that debate in Russia. And of course, you have the underlying assumption that it's essentially the ideational, not just packaging, but I think foundation behind the genocidal nature of Russia's war on Ukraine and of its treatment of Ukraine over the centuries, in that, whatever is Ukrainian is actually just Russian. So I think that adds an extra layer. There's also this sense that I think we saw with, the incredible amounts of looting, particularly that still go on, but, that were especially remarked upon during the early phases of the full-scale invasion of, to the victor, the spoils, and this sense that, when you invade or conquer a land, you take everything and send it back home via Pochta Russi, via the post of Russia that you can get hold of. So again, a very complex interplay of factors, but I think the short answer is they don't really justify it, because they just don't discuss it, and I'm not sure that there would be a massive problem with it anyway.
But that's, I guess, a huge difference between Russian Empire and countries that are no longer empires somehow. Because if you go to a British museum, you will see that this is Egypt, this is Myanmar. Yeah, they're not going to call that this is something that, I don't know, belongs to British people somehow in terms of history or culture. But in Russia, they will just say that all of this is Russian. They're not going to explain to you where it's come from. In general, this battle of who belongs to Ukraine have been happening for a pretty long time, that when Ukrainians are going around the world and explaining, okay, this guy is not Russian, he's Ukrainian or maybe Polish or maybe something like this. I think one of the most famous, it was a fight for Kazimir Malevich, which is still considered as Russian, but the main museum in Amsterdam only last year reclassified Malevich as Ukrainian artist with Polish roots. And there are many fights going on right now for a Mariupol-born Greek origin artist Archip Kuinji or Ivazovsky. And why do you think it's so difficult to work with this? Why it's so difficult for cultural institutions to actually get rid of Russian narratives in culture and to actually follow real historical facts and rename, reclassify artists the way it's supposed to be?
I mean, again, I can't pretend to have a very great answer, because I myself also don't fully understand the answer, particularly if we're talking about Malevich, where probably, I mean, he's easily my favorite artist, and I mean, some of his work so clearly engages with the Ukrainian national question as well. And of course, if we think about some of the more haunting, perhaps less well known, but definitely haunting pieces, like The Running Man, obviously engages with the Holodomor itself. So I'm not really sure. It seems to me just like a refusal. I think it's partly spurred by just the inherent conservatism of a lot of these kind of cultural institutions. It's the people at the top, the elites who decide, who tend to run these things. And they tend to be kind of structurally conservative, even if they might be liberal in certain facets. But more broadly, I think, there is a huge issue, and I feel so sorry for Ukrainians that they constantly have to go around and kind of shout knowledge at people in the West who don't want to hear it, because in my mind it should be, if you've made a mistake as catastrophic as the mistakes we have made in the West regarding, our refusal to listen to and understand the voices of those countries that have experienced Russian colonization and occupation, then I think the least you can do is, do some study, teach yourself, where and learn and address the gaps in your knowledge. And I don't think it should be Ukrainians' responsibility, particularly whilst fighting off, the Russian army and trying to just survive, to also have to kind of be educating us all the time. And yet, unfortunately, I don't see beyond, people, kind of Western allies helping. I don't really see another solution, because there is this real resistance, as your question made perfectly clear, to engaging with these knowledge gaps and addressing them, more importantly.
Yeah, I think in general there are many people in the West, in partner countries, that helping to do this. Yeah, people like you and many others, but yeah, it's still in many ways kind of Ukrainian-led initiative. And do you think that it's this kind of approach to culture and to preserving culture and to heritage has something to do with politics of memory in the West?
I think it has to do with historical narratives more than the politics of memory in some ways, with certain accepted historical narratives of this is, how it is, and then a resistance to them changing. And I think that Russia works very well with this. I mean, we think about all of Russia's, various efforts, including, during the then Secretary of Defense, Ben Wallace's visit to Moscow just ahead of the full-scale invasion. And they prepared an entire exhibition about the Arctic convoys. So these were convoys that set off from the UK during World War II to bring supplies to Murmansk. And it's been a real focus of Russian propaganda over the years. In the UK, this idea of, two powers, fighting together for, to defeat a common enemy. And it clearly, it clearly plays on Britain's very powerful, very emotionally powerful cultural memory of World War II. And, works to, yes, I suppose you could say it's a form of soft power, but I think, you could also say that it's an influence operation. I guess depends how you want to approach it. Right now, it feels more like an influence operation.
You mentioned before, and in general in your work, you research a lot the politics of memory. Yeah? Can you maybe tell a little bit on what it is and this kind of difference between, I would say, democratic approach to it, like more liberal approach to it, and approach of autocratic state to the national memory, to historical memory?
In some ways, I'm not sure the difference is one of democracy or autocracy so much as, because you see many of the tactics that Russia does in democratic countries, but the difference is that you have debate around these things, and you have, a robust group of historical scholars to provide the context in a way that you don't have in Russia, because, historical scholars have been over the years purged or self-censored or specially selected so that they push, very politicized narratives. I think the big difference, and this is something for us to be wary of in democracies just as much, it's obviously too late for autocracies, is the idea that historical narratives or professing certain historical narratives are the mark of a patriot or the mark of one's true national identity. I think that's the point, because they aren't, and because one can have a very different view very different view of history. Another distinction that's important to make is whether or not somebody is engaging in history, i.e. they're genuinely making an objective approach, might be flawed, but an objective effort to work out how things were in the past, rather than essentially playing around with cultural or collective memory. So the way that things are the way that past is now remembered in order to gain political power or influence or to affect one's emotion. I don't think you can stop the politics of history or the use of history, but what you can do is, I think, be more aware of it, and also to understand that it's really just almost functions like a grammar or a second language that distracts us from what is really being spoken about. So if we talk about the case of Great Russian culture, which you brought up, okay, fine, but what relevance does that have to today's situation? Does it mean, therefore, that we have to not fight back or not help Ukraine fight back against Russia because of Golden Age poetry? Is that what it means? I think the politics memory is very good at seemingly wrapping discussions around politics in kind of historical context, but that's not what it's doing. Historical context is using facts, what we can know, and then building out of that certain patterns. Politics of memory is trying to use certain kind of quite emotional narratives about the past that are not really focused in historical fact to make claims about how things should be in the present. And that's the difference, because they almost adopt the legitimacy or the scholarly language or the scholarly reputation that history or historians might have, but they use them purely for political purposes. It's essentially propaganda.
Thank you so much, Jade. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Thank you everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please support us at buymeacoffee.com/Ukrainier International and follow us on social media in different languages. You can find all the links in the podcast description. And thank you for listening.